Thank you, Bill. We heard from Mr. Carney today about how racism plays out in the conquest and exploitation of African countries, something that we don't often hear about in North America. And I think that lack of reporting is indicative of racism itself. Why do the powers that be, the corporate-owned media that is one with the U.S. government, not care about blatant racism happening in Africa and the sufferings and death of countless men, women, and children? Obviously, in the minds of those who control the flow of information, those people simply don't matter. The 1% benefit from the theft and exploitation of these people, and that's all that counts to them. We heard from Ms. Raja about Islamophobia and the horrific exploitation of people throughout of that. While the horrific exploitation of people throughout Africa is more or less ignored, Islamophobia today is actually embraced. As Ms. Raja mentioned, candidate Donald Trump has built his candidacy on, among other things, Islamophobia. And both he and the Democratic candidate want to increase the bombing of mostly Muslim countries. You recall in May of last year, anti-Islam protesters held a demonstration in Arizona. Armed demonstrators surrounded a mosque during services. The demonstration was peaceful, with one of the demonstrators even being invited into the mosque, and after his visit, he said he was mistaken about Muslims. But imagine, if you will, the reaction if a group of peaceful Muslims took up arms and surrounded a Catholic church during Mass, a synagogue during services, or any other Christian or Jewish house of worship. I can just imagine the body count, and all the victims would be Muslim. So the killing of Africans by corporate representatives and of Muslims directly by the U.S. government, is this anything new? Are these murderous policies something that have just been dreamed up by President Barack Obama? No, and I won't take the time to detail the horrendous practices of the U.S. since its founding, but I will discuss a few. When the earliest Europeans arrived in North America, they found, of course, a land rich in natural resources. Unfortunately, it was inhabited by millions of people. Yet in the eyes of those early settlers, the natives were only savages. After the colonies declared independence, the federal government decreed that it would manage all the affairs of the so-called Indians. The natives, who had lived from time immemorial managing their own affairs, were now to be managed by people who wanted the land that they relied on for their very existence. The list of treaties that the U.S. made with the natives and subsequently violated, sometimes within a matter of days, would take volumes to detail. But little has changed in intervening 200 years. Native Americans today are still exploited, still stuck on reservations, and still suffering under government management. It isn't surprising that the Black Lives Matter movement has embraced the cause of the natives, currently seen in opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Palestinian activists in that country, which also suffers under the heavy hand of U.S. racism, and the Black Lives Matter movement offer mutual support. Perhaps more than ever before, divergent groups that experience U.S. exploitation are aligning with each other to achieve mutual goals for justice. Before I return to an abbreviated litany of U.S. crimes against humanity, I want to mention what has been called missing white women syndrome. Think for a moment, if you will, about missing women you've heard reported about on the news. Elizabeth Smart and Lacey Peterson are two that come to my mind. There are a few others whose faces I can imagine from various news reports, and all of them are white. White women of color who disappear make the news. White women who disappear make the news. When women of color disappear, there is little reporting. Again, we need to consider the racism of those who control the corporate-owned media. If the lives of Africans in Africa have no meaning or importance, why should the lives of women of African descent have any in the U.S.? And if Native Americans are completely expendable, why should missing Native women draw any attention? And while we're discussing lives that, in the eyes of the U.S. government, seem to have no meaning, let's talk about unarmed black men. In the U.S., they apparently serve as target practice for the white police, who kill them for no other reason than their race, and do so with nearly complete impunity. I see that the officer in Tulsa who shot and killed Terrence Crutcher is being charged with manslaughter. Why the charge isn't first-degree murder, I don't know, but at least she's being charged. But what about the murderers of Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Carl Nivens, and the numerous other innocent victims? Why are they allowed to walk free? But let's return for a minute to racism in the war. Bill, a moment ago, mentioned the Philippines. After the U.S. annexed the Philippines, William Howard Taft, who later became U.S. president, was appointed the civil governor of the Philippines. He referred to the Filipino people as his little brown brothers. Major General Adna R. Chaffee, also in the Philippines with U.S. military at the time, described the Philippine people thusly, quote, "We are dealing with a class of people whose character is deceitful, who are absolutely hostile to the white race, and who regard life as of little value, and finally, who will not submit to our control unless absolutely defeated and whipped into such condition," close quote. The U.S. is always talking about winning the hearts and minds of the people whose nations it is invading. Yet the Filipino people, like the Vietnamese 70 years later and the Iraqis 30 years after that, needed to submit to U.S. control. It's hard to win the hearts and minds of the people you are killing. In 1901, about 3 years into the war, the Balangea massacre, and I may be mispronouncing that, occurred during the Samar campaign. In the town of Balangea on the island of Samar, the Filipinos surprised the Americans in an attack that killed 40 U.S. soldiers. Now, the U.S. reveres U.S. soldiers who are allegedly defending the homeland, but has no regard for other people who are defending theirs. Brigadier General Jacob K. H. Smith ordered the execution of everyone in the town over the age of 10. He said, quote, kill and burn, the more you kill and the more you burn, the more you please me," close quote. Between 2,000 and 3,000 Filipinos, 1/3 of the entire population of Samar, died in this massacre. During World War I, tens of thousands of African Americans participated and demonstrated bravery and valor. There was a belief that, standing side by side with their white compatriots, serving the country they both lived in, a new racial equality would be born. However, this was not to be the case. Throughout the war, the U.S. government and the military feared the ramifications of African American soldiers participating freely in French culture. They warned the French not to associate with African Americans and disseminated racist propaganda, as I think Bill's already mentioned. This included falsely accusing African American soldiers of raping white women. The French, however, didn't seem impressed with U.S. propaganda efforts against African Americans. Unlike the U.S., which awarded no medals to any African American soldier who served in World War I until years after the war, and then only after the soldier had died, the French awarded hundreds of its most important and prestigious medals to African American soldiers due to their exceptional heroic efforts. In World War II, it can't be denied that the German army committed unspeakable atrocities. Yet in the U.S., it wasn't the government only that was criticized. Hatred towards all Germans was encouraged in novels, movies, and newspapers. U.S. citizens don't like to think much about concentration camps for Japanese Americans. Once Pearl Harbor was bombed and the U.S. entered the war, all Japanese residents in the U.S., including native-born citizens, were under suspicion. As O'Brien and Parsons, in their book, The Home Front, World War II and American Society, state, their treatment was far from humane. Quote, when the government decided to relocate Japanese Americans, they were not merely driven from their homes and communities on the West Coast and rounded up like cattle, but actually forced to live in facilities meant for animals for weeks and even months before being moved to their final quarters. Confined in stockyards, racetracks, cattle stalls at fairgrounds, they were even housed for a time in converted pig pens. When they finally got to the concentration camps, they might find that state medical authorities tried to prevent them from receiving medical care, or, as in Kansas, refused to permit doctors to issue state birth certificates to children born in the camps, as if to deny the infants' legal existence, not to mention their humanity. Later, when the time came to begin releasing them from the camps, racist attitudes often blocked their resettlement. Close quote. The decision to inter Japanese Americans had many justifications, all based on racism. California Attorney General Earl Warren, perhaps, was most prominent among them. On February 21st, 1942, he presented testimony to the Select Committee investigating national defense migration, and he displayed great hostility to foreign-born and American-born Japanese people. I'll quote a portion of his testimony. Quote, we believe that when we were dealing with the Caucasian race, We have methods that will test the loyalty of them, and we believe we can, in dealing with the Germans and the Italians, arrive at some fairly sound conclusions because of our knowledge of the way they live in the community and have lived for many years. But when we deal with the Japanese, we're in an entirely different field, and we cannot form any opinion that we believe to be sound. Their method of living, their language, make for this difficulty. I had together about 10 days ago about 40 district attorneys and 40 sheriffs in the state to discuss this alien problem. I asked all of them if in their experience any Japanese had ever given them any information on subversive activities or any disloyalty to this country. The answer was unanimously that no such information had ever been given. Now this is almost unbelievable. You see, when we deal with the German aliens, when we deal with the Italian aliens, we have many informants who are most anxious to help authorities to solve this alien problem. Close quote. Now please recall that this man was later Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, let's move on briefly to Vietnam. The U.S. attitude of the inferiority of the Vietnamese people, and therefore the ability to treat them as subhuman, was a constant in Vietnam, but perhaps was most blatantly manifested during the My Lai massacre. On March 16, 1968, between 347 and 504 unarmed citizens were killed in South Vietnam under the direction of Second Lieutenant William Calley. The victims, mainly women, children, including infants, and the elderly, were savagely killed and their bodies mutilated. Many of the women were raped. In her book, An Intimate History of Killing, Face-to-Face Killing in 20th Century Warfare, Joanna Burke said this, quote, "Prejudice lay at the very heart of the military establishment, and in the Vietnam context, Calley was originally charged with the premeditated murder of Oriental human beings rather than human beings. And undeniably, men who carried out atrocities had highly prejudicial views about their victims. Calley recalled that on arriving in Vietnam, his main thought was, 'I'm the big American from across the sea. I'll sock it to these people here.'" Close quote. Another soldier, Michael Bernhard, who did not take part in the massacre, said of his comrades this, quote, "A lot of those people wouldn't think of killing a man. I mean, a white man, a human, so to speak." Close quote. Sergeant Scott Camel said this, quote, "It wasn't like they were humans. They were a gook or a commie, and it was okay." Excuse my wording. It's what they said. I'm quoting it. Close quote. The attitudes were well learned by U.S. soldiers sent to Vietnam. Another soldier said, "It was easy killing them gooks. They wasn't even people. They was lower down than animals." So this is the U.S. military at work, going around the world, spreading its bizarre form of democracy to unsuspecting nations that often, before U.S. interference, were doing just fine governing themselves. It supports the racist regime of Israel, apparently seeing the abject suffering of Palestinians in the same light as the suffering of African Americans or Native Americans in the U.S., simply unworthy of consideration. It encourages terms such as camel jockey or raghead to demean freedom fighters in the deserts of the Middle East. And all this time, it proclaims itself as a beacon of freedom and democracy, a fairy tale not believed much outside its own borders. This is why we're here this weekend, to forward the radical idea that we can live in a world beyond war and without the unspeakable racism that is part of it. Thank you. We'll now open. Thank you.